enjoyed your wander if you went forward around the cathedral and things. If not, if you put your feet up, I hope you enjoyed that too. It's my privilege now to introduce to you John Durell, who I first met when I was in my early 20s in Northern Synod. At that point, I'd forgotten how many hats you wore in the Synod actually, John, until I looked you up in the ear. As he was at the point when I arrived in Northern Synod, the ecumenical officer, the communications officer, and the synod clerk. And there he was until Northern Synod sent me off to college. But he did begin his ministry in the northeast, which was after he'd been ministering other places in Sunderland. And he's going to come and talk to us now about the Presbyterians in Sunderland. John, over to you.
Thank you. Well, visitors from the deep south will obviously be well aware by now, if you weren't before, that they're in the one corner of England where our shared church traditions have been dominated by Presbyterianism. So on the basis of a bit of research done many years ago now over a sabbatical period, I'll try to give you a glimpse of how that Presbyterian story began and developed in what is now the city of Sunderland. Just a dozen miles or so down the road, at the mouth of the River Wear, whose banks here might have been enhancing your early morning walk if you took one. I think there's a fine forecast for tomorrow, since we were deprived of the opportunity of going down to the depths this afternoon. Well, this story of Presbyterianism in Sunderland is one that offers no clear indication of just where and when it all really began. There's at least one rural congregation up in Northumberland that's a 1662 foundation, but there's nothing like that this close to the centre of power in Durham. I think I'm going to be contradicted at some point, but that's what's in my mind. Clearly the people of Sunderland had parliamentary sympathies during the Civil War, unlike Royalist Newcastle, so it's very easy to see how these lingering and bitter rivalries are rooted. And Callan's celebrated list of ejected ministers includes one William Graves, who'd been installed at Bishop Wearmouth in 1653. Now, no doubt there was plenty that would be of interest to us going on immediately following the Restoration and in the years before the Toleration Act, but we've got very little documentation. We know that there were several individuals between 1674 and 1677 who were summoned to the Bishop's Court here in Durham and charged with such offences as not attending church or attending conventicles, and being schismatics and offenders against all order. It sounds very much like Quakers, but I'm sure not all of them were Quakers. The Toleration Act, when it came, was to give such people the label of Protestant dissenters, often with the word Presbyterian in parentheses attached in the records. The first place of worship in the township of Sunderland, which is even nearer the river mouth than Bishop Wearmouth, they're all the same place today, that first place of worship was the Cornmarket Chapel, founded in 1711, and simply licensed for Protestant dissenters. Life clearly was not easy for this congregation. throughout the reign of Queen Anne. They were able to support a chapel for up to 500 people. But even though the principle of toleration had been inscribed in statute for over a generation, the only place that they could find to build their chapel was in the minister's back garden. I'd like to know much more about this minister. George Wilson. Clearly he was a Puritan of the old school, but how and where he was ordained, questions which were to matter so much to later generations, we simply don't know. Politically, he was a Whig. The story is told that on the occasion of one of Marlborough's victories over the French, the local Tories brought out a hogshead of ale onto the street to regale the populace. They dragged Wilson out of his house and insisted that he drink the Queen's health on his knees. And when he protested he never kneeled but to his God, the mob began breaking his windows. And worse than that, they came back at the dead of night with a working party to dig under the north wall of the chapel. When it gave way the following Sunday morning, the congregation escaped just in time. The other reference in history to George Wilson is particularly worth telling in this Isaac Watts anniversary year. The publication of Watts's hymns and spiritual songs quickly brightened up dissenting worship, at least in some quarters. Wilson, it seems, was quite a fan, and he introduced them to the congregation, allegedly without consultation. Needless to say, not everyone was happy. And the unhappy group quickly split away, found themselves a room to meet in for a few years, and eventually, in 1739, built Robinson's Lane Chapel, the first of the 3 buildings to house the congregation soon to be known as the Scotch Church, later as St George's, and now Stockton Road. Fast forward to the early years of the 20th century, by which time St George's proudly saw itself as the cathedral of the Presbytery of Durham. Their benefactor, shipbuilder Sir Robert Bartram, had played a significant role in the building of the 1890 church. If you drive straight to Sunderland on the A690, you will eventually see its landmark lantern tower looming in the distance. But be careful, because this is the point at which the gradient increases and you realise you're passing a speed camera. Sir Robert Bartram had delighted in quoting the words of Charles II that Presbyterianism was no religion for a gentleman. Clearly, by this stage of things, this thriving congregation had a story worth sharing and celebrating as widely as possible. Not least, as they were beginning to look forward to the forthcoming bicentenary. But here was the problem. Just when did this story really begin? Now, you might have put up an argument that the bicentenary had already happened. Cornmarket Chapel had been founded in 1711. But clearly, George Wilson was no Presbyterian. Never mind the lack of a valid ordination certificate, no minister who introduced a new hymn book without consultation could possibly be a Presbyterian. Amateur and professional church historians all had their say. The best advice came from local man Robert Hislop, who saw 1736 as a kind of datum line, the year when the breakaway congregation had called a minister who was a licentiate of the Church of Scotland and had been properly ordained by the Presbytery of Glasgow. But, as is so often the case among us, it was buildings that dominated the arguments. And the 1739 construction of Robinson's Lane Chapel was seen to be the event to celebrate. Well, sadly, there were other things going on in the world by 1939, so the bicentenary remained uncelebrated. Like the writer to the Hebrews, I find that time would fail me to tell all the stories that I might have wanted to relate. Over the years following the establishment of the Robinson's Lane Chapel, Presbyterian churches of different hues of blue sprung up all over Sunderland. Some of them, from time to time, drifted in and out of Congregationalism, although, truth to tell, that didn't always make a lot of difference. But secession churches did have a much stronger Presbyterian structure than Robinson's Lane, which could never be more than associated with the Church of Scotland, since law prevented the Kirk operating beyond national boundaries. And incidentally, there is no record of Presbyterians in Sunderland succumbing to Unitarianism, as we discover elsewhere. But I would have liked to tell you more about John Parker, of Spring Garden Lane Chapel, who gave a children's sermon every year until his death, and was sure to keep those children away from the annual fair on the town moor. Or there's the 37-year ministry of his predecessor at the Burger congregation, Thomas Mason. Thankfully, Thomas Mason had kept up his Hebrew, and now he was able to make a little bit extra by coaching the children of Jewish families who were starting to settle in Sunderland. Well, £80 per annum doesn't go that far when you're trying to raise 22 children. 14 made it to adulthood. Some of the older lads helped out by grinding corn in the attic of the manse, and the most successful ended up captaining his own ship. So Mother could then start selling the tea and coffee that he brought home with him from their now rather more salubrious residence. And I guess through it all, Mason remained glad that he kept up that Hebrew. But I'm going to remain and finish with Robinson's Lane, associated with the Church of Scotland, who in 1821 called the Revd J.T. Patterson to be their minister. Now, I do hope they told him about the state of the building before he accepted the call. It was 15 years since they'd resolved to get cornered spouts put along the front of the chapel, but significantly said that the spouts on the back could simply be examined. Eventually, there were plans for a new building in a far superior quarter of town, and soon the expected construction costs leapt up from £1,500 to £4,100. Another interesting point in these early years of Patterson's ministry, the heading on the pages of the session minute book changes from Scotch Church to St George's Chapel, and no one bothered to record why. Well, their new minister turned out to be quite a luminary within English Presbyterianism. Indeed, his portrait was later to be treasured at Church House, only of course to be destroyed in the bombing of 1945. In the first years of his ministry, he was a leading participant in plans to form an English synod of congregations like his that were in association with the Church of Scotland. The various secession churches, of course, had their various associate synods, so they developed a much stronger Presbyterian structure. But for all of Paterson's good work over these years, the plans for an English synod seemed to come to nothing. However, eventually, in 1836, the first meeting of such a synod did take place in Manchester. Though it seems there were then considerable divisions under the surface. Some, no doubt, hoping for that impossible prize of incorporation into the Church of Scotland, while others were anxious to resist Scottish domination and simply become once more an expression of English descent. In the end, their minds were made up for them when the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland pronounced that nothing closer than existing ministerial communion could ever be possible. And this actually strengthened the developing plans for the English Synod. And when Dr. Paterson, as he now was, probably through recognition of the work he'd been doing, came to chair the Carlisle Synod of 1842, every English presbytery had become a full member. Now, of course, while unifying forces were at work this side of the border, Presbyterian life in Scotland was very different. And the second great wave of secession crested in the disruption of 1843. And the way that story is told is very dependent on the narrator's personal history. But we would probably all agree that it was a tragedy. Most English Presbyterians were sympathetic with the Free Church position, and having just been denied links with the Scottish establishment, they were learning more and more to throw in their lot with other free churches in England. But clearly, many Presbyterian families here will have been very aware of the issues, and I imagine that for some, disruption will have taken the combative role of Brexit in our own time. Except you couldn't refuse to talk about it. Most English Presbyterian ministers were Scots, and they retained loyalties to Scotland. Of the 72 ministers in pastoral charge in England in 1843, 36 hastened north to parishes made vacant by the disruption. But things were very much at their worst here in the northeast, in the Newcastle Presbytery. J.T. Paterson saw colleague after colleague disappear, leaving only Charles Tossock of South Shields to assist him. He was now 92 years old. But between them, they held everything together, and churches throughout the region remained loyal to the young Presbyterian Church in England. Nectamen consumabata.
Thank you, John, for that insight into Presbyterianism in Sunderland and this point. That story of there not being many left in the northeast sounds rather familiar. But a few more than those that are 92. But is there any questions that anyone would like to ask of John?
Yes, you mentioned that the usual drift of Unitarianism didn't affect the patch you're talking about. Have you got a hypothesis why not?
Not at all, no. I just find it a great mystery. And when I was sort of doing this little bit of research, I did try and find some explanation, and I never succeeded at all. Really not. I mean, I suppose there was at that time a strong Scottish contingent who were perhaps more likely to know their catechism and all the rest of it. But I don't know that that's sufficiently convincing. And of course there is all through this period the whole question of how Scottish do you have to be to belong to a Presbyterian church in England. But in my time there were families that went back a few generations, who'd always been and didn't seem to have any Scottish connections. On the other hand, obviously the church in its heyday found its strength in migrant Scots.
David.
I've never followed this up, John, since my own research, which is donkey's years old now. But it does seem to me that you're absolutely right. You know, the religious border kind of belongs at the time rather than between, and I suspect the reason that there wasn't the drift into Unitarianism was precisely that it's close to Scotland and to, you know, mainstream Presbyterianism.
I was just going to add to that train of thought. Not everyone who drifted into Unitarianism did so from Presbyterianism.
Yes.
In Kent, a lot of General Baptists became Unitarians, for instance. And there's also the class element to it. In some places, and I say this somewhat tentatively, but where there were more people who could read and write and be more impressed by the latest fad that they'd been reading somewhere, there was often more of a Unitarian drift.
Or even arguably, for fads, read scholarship.
Quite so. You call it a fudge, I call it a compromise. Can I follow it up with a question on something slightly different? I was struck by the fairly rapid change from Scotch Chapel to St George's. Quite often in a number of places, St George's was chosen to emphasise the English nature of the congregation. And I'm thinking of Stockton-on-Tees, which had a St Andrew's Presbyterian Church and a St George's Presbyterian Church until 1934.
Yes, yeah.
But it's quite a sharp about turn to leap from Scotch Chapel to emphasising St George.
Yes, I mean, again, there's just no record.
No, indeed.
I was searching for something.
And of course,
nothing.
the architecture of the building, at least, was, I think, was based on church in Belfast.
And that's the present building. This change was in the
earlier ones,
in the second of the three buildings, yes.
Yes.
Which was a nice classical style building.
Yeah.
Can I ask about membership? In terms of how that trajectory worked? Because you mentioned about people leaving. How did the numbers work out, those that left and those that were left behind? Is there any evidence?
Well, a fair bit of evidence, I think, yes. Patterson, so we're talking, he's coming in the 1820s and staying on for nearly 40 years. One of his first acts on arriving was to write up the story of the church so far in what is now called the church book, and is such an interesting item that at least for a time a replica was on the front cover of the advertisements for the Tyne and Wear archives. And that seems to indicate that there were rather more coming in than going, and certainly numbers continued rising in the sort of time we would expect, so into the 20th century. And this is the time also the church is sort of moving from the East End halfway, and then the final building is in the new, very much West End development. You get a sense that there is a sort of social climbing aspect, as well as as well as numbers. But it's reasonably well documented, yes.
And reflective of the kind of careers that people who were members were following.
Full of doctors,
Yes.
yeah. Few vets.
Yeah, that says quite a lot.
Yes,
doesn't it?
yes, yes, it does. Yeah, that's right.
Would it be fair, following that up, do you think, John, to say that certainly by its final building and home, St George's was more a church for the people who owned the shipyards rather than the people who worked in them?
Yes, it was, except the church had a very lively concern for people in the East End, expressed through missions. So there were at least 3 missions planted in the East End, and I mean, by my time, those had been long closed, but there were a few people whose background was in the missions. So I think there'd always been that element, but the people, the kind of people who were in the, as you rightly said, it's a replica of a Belfast church. It's really bizarre. I've never managed to discover whether they got some kind of money back because they were using second-hand plans or what. This is an extraordinary building, and you get some indication of the kind of people who were there because there are still, under some of the back pews, the metal racks for putting your top hat safely out of the way.
That's what we're missing.
Any other questions? Take it as quiet that everyone is reflecting on that, and thank you for that really interesting insight into Presbyterianism in Sunderland.
Very well. Oh,
A small gift from
thank you so much.
Society for your time, and yes, thank you for that.
Thank you.